Minutes after giving birth. Still bleeding. Still trembling. Her newborn barely in her arms. Her husband walked in. Not with flowers. Not with tears. But with divorce papers. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. Because she had no idea. She had just signed a $1 billion deal. And the man divorcing her was about to lose everything. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and heartbreak. Machines beeped softly as she lay there. Weak, exhausted, her body shattered from childbirth. Her baby cried for the first time, while her husband looked at her like she was already a mistake. No love. No guilt. Just cold papers placed on her hospital bed. "Sign it," he said. "As soon as you're done bleeding." She didn't read the documents. She trusted him. What she didn't know was devastating. Those signatures weren't just ending a marriage. They were transferring ownership of a billion-dollar empire. And by the time the truth came out, the man who thought he had won would realize he had just divorced himself from his own fortune. Hello, dear listeners. Thank you for joining me today. Before I begin my story, I would be very happy if you subscribed to the channel and left a comment writing which state or country you are listening from. It always warms my heart to see how far our stories travel. I was still bleeding when he asked me to sign. I remember the ceiling first. White. Too white. So clean it felt cruel. I kept staring at it, blinking slowly, wondering if this was what survival looked like. My body felt like it didn't belong to me anymore, like something had been taken apart and stitched back together without care. Pain lived everywhere. In my stomach. In my legs. In my chest. Every breath reminded me that I had crossed a line I could never return from. The machines beside me beeped softly, rhythmically, like they were counting something I could no longer keep track of: seconds, heartbeats, pieces of me. And then there was the crying. Small. Fragile. Real. My baby. My hands trembled as I tried to move, my arms heavy, my fingers weak. When they finally placed him near me, I felt something crack open inside my chest. I had imagined this moment so many times. I thought I would feel whole, complete, safe. Instead, I felt exposed, broken, alone. I was still bleeding when the door opened. I thought it was a nurse. Or maybe a doctor coming to tell me everything would be okay. For one foolish second, I even thought it might be him, walking in with tears in his eyes, regret on his face, ready to hold my hand and tell me I was strong. I had rehearsed that scene in my head during all those lonely nights of pregnancy. But when the door opened, the air changed. It was him. My husband. The man I had loved quietly, obediently, for years. He didn't rush toward me. Didn't look relieved. Didn't even smile. He walked in like this was an inconvenience. Like he had parked illegally and was annoyed he had to come inside at all. His eyes scanned the room, not me. Not the blood. Not the 4 in my arm. Not the pain written all over my face. He didn't look at the baby. Not even once. That hurt more than the stitches. "You're awake," he said. Not "Are you okay?" Not "How do you feel?" Just, "You're awake." I tried to smile. God knows I tried. My lips moved before my heart could stop. "Them. We have a son," I whispered. My voice sounded strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. He glanced briefly in the direction of the crib. A glance so quick it barely counted as acknowledgement. "Yeah," he said flatly. That was it. No emotion. No wonder. No fear. Just a word. He pulled a chair closer to the bed but didn't sit. Instead, he placed a thick folder on the edge of my hospital blanket. Brown. Heavy. Official. My stomach tightened. "What's that?" I asked. He checked his watch. "I need you to sign something." I stared at him, confused. Now, my body shook as another wave of pain hit. I could feel warmth beneath the sheets. Blood I couldn't stop. Weakness I couldn't fight. "The doctor said you're conscious," he replied. That's enough. Enough. That word lodged itself somewhere deep inside me. I looked at the folder again. The papers inside were filled with words that blurred together, legal language, sharp lines, signatures waiting for ink. "I don't understand," I said quietly. "What is this?" "Formalities," he answered. "Formalities." As if the last 9 months hadn't been the hardest of my life. As if the nights I cried alone didn't matter. As if the way he slowly disappeared while my body grew heavier was just paperwork. I wanted to ask more questions. I wanted to say no. But love has a way of making you small. And marriage taught me to trust even when my instincts screamed. Please, I said, almost apologetically, can we do this later? He sighed. I don't have time later. Time. He had time for meetings. Time for business trips. Time for everything except me. He handed me a pen. My fingers barely closed around it. They shook so badly I had to steady my hand against the mattress. I scanned the pages, but the words wouldn't stay still. My head was foggy. My body was exhausted. My heart just wanted peace. Is this about the baby? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Yes, he said finally. That was enough to silence me. I would have signed anything for my child. I lowered the pen to the paper. Each stroke felt heavy, like I was carving something permanent into my own skin. My name looked unfamiliar, crooked, weak. When I finished, I looked up at him, searching his face for something, anything. Regret. Guilt. Hesitation. There was nothing. He took the folder back, flipped through the pages quickly, nodded to himself, and closed it. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and said the words that shattered what little strength I had left. We're done. I didn't understand. What? I whispered. I'm filing for divorce, he said calmly. You'll be served officially, but this speeds things up. The room started spinning. Divorce. Here. Now. While I was still bleeding. While our child was crying. I just gave birth, I said, my voice breaking. That doesn't change anything, he replied. I felt something inside me collapse. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg. I wanted to disappear. But all that came out was silence. He turned toward the door. I'll have my lawyer handle the rest. And, just like that, he walked out, leaving me alone in a hospital bed, with a newborn, and papers I hadn't understood. I didn't know then what I had signed. I didn't know that my pain had masked the biggest truth of all. All I knew was this. The man I trusted the most had chosen the moment I was weakest to destroy me. Alone, but not broken. Yet, the room was silent, except for the soft whimpers of my newborn son. I could hear every breath he took, every tiny sigh, every quivering cry. And yet, it wasn't comforting. It was a reminder. A reminder that I was alone. Completely alone. The door had clicked shut behind him. No apology. No hesitation. No lingering glance of concern. Just absence. I stared at the folded papers on the nightstand. The edges caught the harsh fluorescent light. I hadn't even read them, not really. I had trusted him. Always trusted him. Always believed that he would protect us. And yet, here we were. Shattered. I tried to lift my baby to my chest, to feel the warmth, to fill the emptiness. But my hands were trembling. My arms ached. And I cried, not loudly, not enough to wake the nurses, but silently, so that only my heart knew the truth. I felt betrayed. Betrayed in a way that words could not capture. Betrayed in a way that left me feeling smaller than I had ever been. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rage. I wanted to throw something, anything, at the world that had allowed this to happen. But I couldn't. I couldn't even lift myself from the hospital bed without the ache in my chest reminding me of my body's fragility. And so I lay there, holding my son close, his tiny hands grasping at my fingers, his little eyes blinking against the harsh lights, unaware of the storm I was drowning in. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time had no shape here. I thought about my life. The 9 months of isolation, of dreams and fears intertwined. I thought about the nights I had whispered to him, asking if he cared, if he even noticed, if he loved us enough to stay. And now the answer was clear. He hadn't. A part of me wanted to feel anger, to rage against him, to curse him. But the bigger part, the part that had carried this child for 9 months, that had survived every kick, every ache, every sleepless night, knew something else. I was still here. I had survived. I had made it through. And I held my son, the living proof of my endurance. I rocked him gently, whispering his name, soothing him with everything I had. His tiny body pressed against mine. I could feel his heartbeat, so fragile, so perfect. And in that moment, despite the betrayal, despite the pain, I realized something important. I was still a mother. I still had life in me. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as powerless as I felt. But the shadow of what had happened lingered. The betrayal was like a cold weight pressing on my chest. Every time I looked at him, my husband's face flashed in my mind. Cold, detached, unfeeling. The man I had loved, the man I had trusted, had left us. And yet, as I held my son, a tiny spark flickered inside me, a whisper I barely recognized. You survived this. You will survive what comes next. That night, as the hospital lights dimmed and the world outside continued indifferent, I stayed awake, rocking my son, listening to him breathe, learning every line of his face. I was lonely. I was hurt. I was exhausted. But I was beginning to understand one thing. Even broken, I was not defeated. Even abandoned, I had power. Even when he thought he had one, I had survived. And survival, I realized, was the first step. The weight of silence. The hospital room felt emptier than ever that morning. The machines had stopped beeping. The nurses moved silently, efficiently, unaware of the storm that still raged in me. My son slept in the crib beside me, tiny chest rising and falling like a fragile promise. I ran my fingers along his arms, memorizing him, holding on to him as if sheer will could keep the world from touching him. And then the folder. It wasn't on the nightstand anymore. It had been placed on the table by some assistant the night before. I hadn't noticed it in my exhaustion. I hadn't dared touch it. Now, its presence was impossible to ignore. I stared at it for a long time. It called to me, a quiet, patient whisper I almost didn't recognize. Something about it felt heavy, important. I wanted to leave it alone. I wanted to pretend it didn't exist. But curiosity is a dangerous companion. And I was tired of pretending. I picked it up. The papers were crisp, unfamiliar, covered in legal text that made my head spin. I skimmed through a few lines, feeling more confused than ever. It mentioned numbers I couldn't imagine, terms I didn't understand. Something about shares, ownership, and rights. I frowned. I turned the pages slowly. My pulse started to quicken, a strange mix of fear and anticipation twisting in my stomach. Had I done something? I didn't understand the language. I didn't understand the weight of the words. And yet, somehow, somewhere deep in my chest, I sensed that these papers were more than just a formality. The memories of yesterday came rushing back, the coldness, the divorce papers, his words. And suddenly, the anger I had tried to suppress surged forward. How dare he? How dare he think he could walk away and leave me bleeding in silence? I squeezed the folder tightly, my fingers pressing into the edges until they ached. A spark ignited inside me, not of vengeance yet, not fully, but of realization. I had survived the worst moment of my life. I had held my son in my arms while the man I loved walked out. And still, here I was. Alive. Breathing. Capable of more than he would ever understand. I packed the folder into my bag, feeling a strange mix of trepidation and power. I didn't know why, but instinct told me this folder mattered. It held something that could change everything. I didn't know what. And yet, I felt it. The nurse wheeled me toward the exit. The sunlight hit my face as we passed through the sliding doors. The warmth was almost cruel after the sterile cold of the hospital. I stepped outside, baby in my arms, and for the first time since yesterday, I felt the world shift. Not in a way I could yet control. Not in a way I fully understood. But the shift was there, like a quiet tremor under the ground. A whisper of what was coming. And in that moment, I promised myself quietly, firmly, without words. I would survive. I would rise. I would see this through, even if it killed me. The first spark of power. The car ride home was quiet, almost too quiet. My son slept in my arms, his tiny face soft against my chest. Every now and then he stirred, tiny fingers curling around mine. And each time, I felt a fierce protectiveness rise within me, more raw, more urgent than any fear I had ever known. The city blurred past the window, indifferent to my grief, indifferent to the betrayal that had hollowed me out yesterday. I kept thinking about him. About the man who had walked out of a hospital room as if he had nothing at stake. He thought he had won. He thought leaving me broken, bleeding, scared, and alone would make him powerful. How wrong he was. I pulled the folder from my bag and stared at it again. I didn't fully understand the numbers. The legal jargon was alien. But the weight of it, the weight pressed down on my chest in a way that made my heartbeat skip. Something had shifted. Something was mine now. I didn't know what it was. Not yet. But instinct told me it was important. And more than that, it was a kind of justice that no one could see, no one could stop. I remembered his face yesterday, sharp and cold. The arrogance in his eyes. The way he had assumed I was weak. The way he had believed that leaving me bleeding with a newborn would destroy me. And I smiled. A small, almost invisible smile. That evening, as I bathed our son, I felt it, a spark deep inside me. Not rage. Not revenge. Not yet. Just awareness. I had survived. I had protected life in its most fragile form. And in doing so, I had proven something first to myself, then, eventually, to the world. I was stronger than he ever imagined. I rocked my son in the rocking chair, his eyelids heavy, his breath slow and even. And as I watched him drift to sleep, I whispered promises to myself that I didn't fully understand yet. I will not be broken. I will rise. I will not let him or anyone decide my fate. Outside, the city lights began to glow, casting long shadows across the room. I looked at the folder one last time that night. Somewhere inside it, my life had already changed. Somewhere inside it, the balance had begun to shift. I didn't know exactly how. I didn't know exactly when. I didn't even know fully why. But the spark was there. And for the first time since yesterday, I felt it. A quiet, dangerous, undeniable power stirring inside me. The kind of power that doesn't beg, doesn't explain itself, and doesn't forget. The moment he realized he had lost. The morning sun spilled across the city, indifferent as ever, but the world felt different to me now. I held my son in my arms, feeling the warmth of life I had protected. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet awareness pulsed, a recognition that the world I had been pushed into yesterday was no longer entirely his to control. I didn't fully understand what I had done. I only knew that the papers I had signed legally, blindly, in my exhaustion, carried a weight far beyond a hospital bed or a marriage. He walked into the office later that day, confident. Smug. Arrogant as ever. He thought he had left me defeated. He thought the divorce papers and his cold indifference had broken me. He didn't know what had already happened. The assistant handed him a folder. His name was all over it. The corporation. Shares. Ownership. He flipped through it, his eyes scanning quickly, not because he needed to, but because his ego refused to believe what the papers implied. And then his face changed. Confusion first. Shock second. And finally, panic. I watched him from the corner of the boardroom, unseen. He hadn't expected me here. He hadn't expected me to be calm. To smile. To understand. You signed this? He asked, voice shaking, disbelief cutting through the air like a knife. I did, I said softly. Calmly. Almost like it had always been mine to do. This isn't how, he stammered. He turned the pages again, desperate, trying to find a loophole. There wasn't one. I had signed the deal hours after giving birth. Blindly, yes. Trusting him, yes. But legally, irrevocably, it was mine. He couldn't hide the fear in his eyes now. All his arrogance, all his power, all the years he thought he had control, crumbling. And I didn't gloat. Not yet. I simply stood there, holding my son, the living reminder of everything he had underestimated. The very thing he had dismissed as weakness. You can't do this, he whispered. I smiled faintly. Yes, I did. And for the first time in years, he realized power isn't just about money, influence, or control. It's about timing. It's about courage. It's about surviving when the world thinks you're broken. And I had survived. The boardroom was silent. He had lost his composure, his words, his authority. And I had found mine. This was only the beginning. The first step. The spark of what was coming. I would not forget. I would not forgive so easily. But I would rise. And when the world finally understood what had happened, he would realize just how powerful I had truly become. The fall of his arrogance. He stormed out of the boardroom, slamming the door so hard the glass trembled. I stayed behind, calm. My son slept peacefully in my arms, unaware of the storm raging around us. But I felt it, electric, powerful. The shift had begun. He thought he could intimidate me. He thought anger, threats, and fear would bend me to his will. He had never known me. That evening, my phone rang. It was his lawyer. "Mrs. Your name, there's been an issue. We need to talk immediately," the voice said, faltering slightly. "Your husband, he's upset. He wants to resolve this." I smiled faintly. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. Calm. Controlled. For the first time, he was the one reacting to me. Later, he arrived at my home, pacing like a caged lion. His suit perfect. His posture rigid. His ego shattered. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, voice low and dangerous. "Those papers. I can reverse them. We can fix this." I looked at him, holding my son. "Fix this," I whispered. "Or fix you." His eyes widened. A flicker of panic passed through them. For once, he realized that control was no longer his. You don't know what you're doing," he snapped. "You've made a mistake. You can't." I cut him off softly. "Listen carefully. I was weak yesterday. I trusted you. I signed blindly. But that trust, that weakness, it doesn't exist anymore." He faltered. For the first time, he was silent. And in that silence, I saw the power I had carried all along. Not just in the papers. Not just in the deal. But in surviving him. In surviving the betrayal. In surviving the worst day of my life, and still holding my child. "You think this changes everything?" he asked, almost whispering. I'm still in charge." I laughed softly. A sound he had never heard from me. A sound he wasn't prepared for. "You were never in charge," I said. "You only thought you were. And now, you're discovering something very important." "I am." He turned away, frustrated, muttering. Under his breath. He had underestimated me, as he had underestimated everything that mattered. And I realized that the first taste of power was intoxicating. The kind that doesn't come from threats, or anger, or arrogance. It comes from surviving. It comes from rising when the world expects you to fall. And it comes from taking control quietly, while everyone else thinks they still hold it. That night, I rocked my son to sleep again. The city outside glittered like 1,000 indifferent stars. But inside me, a fire burned, a fire that could no longer be ignored. I was no longer just a mother. I was no longer just someone who had been betrayed. I was the quiet storm. And the world was about to learn it. The world finally saw him fall. The news broke like wildfire. Headlines flashing across every screen. Unexpected billion-dollar transfer shocks corporate world. New owner revealed. Boardrooms buzzed. Investors murmured. Analysts scrambled. And in the middle of it all, he froze. The man who thought he was untouchable, the man who had walked out of a hospital room with divorce papers in hand, the man who believed arrogance and wealth could make him invincible, suddenly realized he had lost. I sat in my home office, my son sleeping peacefully beside me, and scrolled through the news feeds. Every headline, every shocked commentary, was like a punch to his ego. He had underestimated me. Completely. The folder I had signed, barely noticing the weight of it, was now the key to an empire worth more than he could imagine. And the irony wasn't lost on me. The very papers he assumed would ruin me had become my weapon. He arrived at my doorstep later, face pale, hands trembling. "People are talking. They're calling the board." "There," he stammered, clearly flustered. I interrupted, calmly, almost gently. "Yes, they are. And you're finally seeing what happens when you ignore the person you've underestimated." He took a step back, his arrogance slipping, replaced by panic. You can't do this. You signed those papers. They were just formalities. I smiled. Formalities? I whispered. You called my life, my body, my 9 months of sacrifice a formality. And now that formality controls everything you thought you owned. For the first time, I saw it clearly. The man who had believed power was all about wealth, influence, and control had learned that real power comes from courage, survival, and timing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell. I didn't even gloat. I just stood there, calm, smiling faintly, holding the only being who truly mattered in my arms. And he realized, finally, that his arrogance had been his downfall. The public exposure was merciless. Corporate meetings, once his domain, now whispered my name. Investors who once ignored me now sought my attention. The world saw what I had always known. I was not weak. I was not powerless. And he was alone. Alone in a world he had thought he controlled. Alone with the knowledge that the person he had tried to destroy was now stronger than he could ever be. That night, as the city glittered outside my window, I held my son close. I felt a new kind of power rising inside me. Not loud, not boastful. Quiet. Unstoppable. And in that quiet, I knew. The storm had only just begun. The calm before the storm. The city had no idea the storm it was witnessing. From the outside, it looked like just another corporate shakeup. Another billionaire conflict. Another divorce scandal. But inside, the world was shifting. Not just around me, but within me. I sat in my office, holding my son in one arm, the folder with the signed documents on the desk in front of me. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. That calm, I knew, was dangerous. It was the silence that comes before a reckoning. Before power is exercised. Before the world learns that underestimating someone can be fatal. He called me that afternoon. Please, he said, voice low and desperate. This isn't over. We can fix this. Talk to me. Just please don't make this public. I laughed softly. A sound he had never heard before. It wasn't angry. It wasn't vengeful. It was confident. Talk. I whispered. Do you really think you have the right to ask me anything? He stammered, trying to regain control, trying to sound authoritative. But I saw the truth in his eyes. He was afraid. And he knew it. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the skyline. The sun was setting, painting the city gold. My reflection stared back at me from the window, pale, exhausted, yet resolute. I was no longer just a mother. I was no longer just the betrayed wife. I was a force he had never reckoned with. A storm he could not control. A decision he could no longer influence. You always thought I was weak, I said, finally. You always believed that leaving me in that hospital, bleeding and exhausted, would destroy me. That giving birth would make me powerless. But here I am. And everything you ever thought was yours is mine. He fell silent. And in that silence, I realized something important. The real power wasn't the papers. It wasn't the deal. It wasn't even the money. It was me. The woman who survived humiliation. The woman who protected her child. The woman who could stand when everything around her tried to break her. I had found my strength. And now it was time to decide what to do with it. That night, as my son slept, I reviewed the documents again. Every clause. Every line. Every signature. And a plan began to form. Not vengeance. Not yet. But a careful, deliberate reclaiming of what was always mine. Because he had thought he had all the control. And now, slowly, deliberately, I would show him the cost of underestimating me. The first moves of the storm. The city slept, unaware that a quiet storm had already begun. I sat in my office, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating the folder in front of me. Every number, every signature, every clause was a seed of power. A seed I now understood how to use. My son slept in his crib nearby, and every breath he took reminded me of why I could never be weak again. He had called again. Pleading. Desperate. Begging for control he no longer possessed. Please, we can work this out, he had said, voice trembling, almost breaking. This isn't over, but you don't have to. You don't have to make it public. I had smiled softly. Yes, I said, calm, measured. Everything is public now. And everyone will know exactly what happens when someone underestimates me. For the first time, I felt the power that comes not from anger, but from inevitability. It was not about revenge. Not yet. It was about control. About reclaiming what I had been denied. About teaching him, and everyone who watched, that the woman he thought was powerless was stronger than he ever imagined. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting. Investors, lawyers, board members. The world that had ignored me, dismissed me, underestimated me. They would now see me, and he would see it first. I didn't rush. I didn't speak too loudly. I let the air of inevitability settle around me like a cloak. When he arrived, suit pressed, face pale, arrogance nowhere in sight, I simply smiled and nodded. You're early, I said. Yes, he stammered. I just wanted to stop me. I finished. Yes, he whispered. I leaned back, calm, confident. No, I said. Not to stop me. To watch what happens when someone finally stands. I opened the folder and began reviewing key points aloud, clearly, deliberately, for the board to hear. Every clause, every number, every implication was his undoing. The room grew tense. His face paled further. His breathing quickened. And I realized, this was the first real taste of power. The first real moment where he understood that everything he had assumed was under his control was no longer his at all. By the time the meeting ended, whispers had begun. The investors, the board members, even his trusted colleagues. They looked at me differently now. Not as the betrayed wife. Not as the mother still recovering. But as the force that could not be ignored. And he, once so arrogant, so certain, so untouchable, had learned something he would never forget. Underestimating me was the single greatest mistake of his life. That night, I held my son again, rocking him gently. I knew this was only the beginning. The storm had been set in motion. The first moves had been made. And soon, the world and he would feel the full force of what I was capable of. The final spark before the storm. The city was quiet that night, but inside me, nothing was still. I held my son in my arms, his soft breathing a reminder of what mattered most. I thought of the past, the betrayal, the coldness, the divorce papers handed over in a hospital room. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, clarity. He had tried to scare me. He had tried to control me. He had tried to dismiss me as weak. And yet, here I was. Alive. Unbroken. Holding the future in my hands, literally and figuratively. The folder sat on my desk, heavy with implication. Heavy with truth. Heavy with power. I had signed it hours after giving birth. Blindly, yes. But legally, irrevocably. I had changed the balance of power forever. The calls had started that afternoon. Investors. Lawyers. Analysts. Everyone wanted to know who had orchestrated the billion-dollar transfer. And he had nothing. No answers. No control. No idea how to undo it. He came to me again, face pale, hands shaking, his arrogance gone. You can't, he stammered. You don't understand what this means. I looked at him calmly, holding my son, and smiled softly. I understand more than you ever did. I survived betrayal. I survived your cruelty. I survived the worst day of my life. And I am still standing. His panic was almost delicious, but I didn't gloat. Power, I realized, wasn't about making him suffer. It wasn't about proving revenge. It was about control. And for the first time, I had it. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence speak louder than words. He tried to argue, to intimidate, to regain any sense of authority he thought he had. But I had already moved past that. I had already won in ways he couldn't comprehend. And as I looked at him, finally powerless, I felt the calm before the storm that would soon sweep through every part of our lives. I whispered softly to my son, "You're safe. And one day, you'll see that strength isn't about what they take from you, but about what you do when they try." The storm had been lit. The first moves had been made. And when the world finally witnessed the full force of what I was capable of, no one, especially him, would ever underestimate me again.